guys, it's Nikki here. I'm here today to do my Book of the Month review for Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. This book was picked kind of at random by my husband for me to read this month, and he told me he picked it because Disney's rendition of Treasure Island, done as Treasure Planet, is one of his all-time favorite Disney movies, and as such he wanted me to read the book that it was based on. Overall, this is a classic that I think is more specifically aimed at kids than adults. Overall, it's daring decisions, swashbuckling pirates, and a few bawdy sailor songs. And that's all I'm really going to do as my intro here. I'm going to go into the plot where I'm going to discuss the pacing. So the plot of the story is that you follow Jim Hawkins and his doctor friend, a squire, and this crew. And the story overall is just a high seas pirate adventure, which sounds like it'd be super intriguing, and I was excited to pick it up. Within the plot, the pacing was actually pretty good. The start was very slow, but once kind of the inciting event happened, the pacing picked up and stayed consistent through the rest of the story, including into the ending. And the length of the book itself, being rather short, helped also support this pacing by just having less time in which all of these different things had to happen in, which personally for me kept me engaged through the majority of the story. And honestly, the pacing in the bulk of the book is really what kept the story moving along so swiftly. And I'll talk about that kind of in the progression, which is the next section here. So the story itself progressed very nicely, in part because the pacing was so consistent, but also in that every action of the characters pushed the story forward. And I found that there's a really good kind of like cause-effect relationship where regardless of which character it was, every action had an immediate and pretty impactful consequence. My only complaint within this is that like the seemingly good actions never had unintended consequences. It almost exclusively kind of went as planned. And as such, the good guys ended up having pretty good the good guys had pretty good consequences, the bad guys had pretty negative consequences, but that's very minor. And as I said at the beginning, I really appreciated the way that all of the actions really contributed to the story. There wasn't really any fluff or side stories that didn't tie into the main story, which was really, really nice. And now that's kind of all I have to say about the plot in terms of pacing and progression, so I'm going to jump down to the characters next. One thing that was really nice with this specifically is that the characters were very easy to identify with and to identify what side they were on. There were one or two kind of more gray characters, but the good guys and the bad guys were very easy to identify from very early on, and it made the story very easy to follow. The other thing I liked is that the characters communicated pretty effectively to each other, so you knew who was on what side, but also what actions were going to be taken by each side. And again, this just really benefited the reader in that you always knew what was going on and you always knew what direction the story was going to take, which for a young reader I think would be really, really good because it would be a very directed and focused story to help it keep the attention held. For myself, I do like a little bit of uncertainty in a book or a little bit of guessing, so the fact that this plot was so telegraphed, I personally just didn't enjoy as much, but that is a very, very personal preference on my part as well. And the other thing about the characters, and this specifically is kind of what pushes me to say this is more of a younger audience, even though it does have a very broad reach, is that you follow the story through Jim Hawkins' perspective. And so there is this kind of more childlike filter over the entire adventure. And so some of the things that are potentially very violent and very dangerous kind of have a little bit of a haze around them because the childlike perspective is really kind of making that more fuzzy and just concentrating a lot more on this kind of adventure-focused narrative. And with that, I'm just going to give you a couple pros and cons, although I had mentioned a few things in my plot and character discussion. So for me, the two big pros are that the story is very easy to follow between the directed story, the good communication between characters, and the very easy to identify good and bad sides, and a very specific end goal made this story very easy to follow, and I think would be a lot more appealing to a younger audience than myself. I know a lot of people who have reviewed this book. I looked up some reviews after I finished it, specifically talk about reading it as a child or reading it to their children. It's definitely something to keep in mind in terms of content. And my other pro was that the pacing was consistent through the majority of the book, and it really lent itself well to the storytelling and really made it easy to keep a reader engaged while they're going through the book. And the flip side is the cons. Again, I just did a couple here. One con for me is that the characters were pretty flat or cut and dry. And while this isn't necessarily a bad thing overall, the fact that this book did include a couple great characters, I wish that the good and bad weren't as strongly delineated as they were, and that there was a little bit more guessing as to what side people were falling on or what side was good and bad. And while for me, my second con for this book is, and it's not even it's not even something that I necessarily hated about the book. It's just something that pulled me out of my enjoyment, and that's that while reading the book, I was engaged, but as soon as I put it down, I would forget parts of the story. I'd have to kind of breeze through what just happened. When I switched to the audiobook, I had to re-listen to portions of this book multiple times just because as soon as I stopped and did something else, all memory of the story was gone for me. So while I enjoyed it while I was reading it, as soon as I put it down, the story just became forgettable. And so I had a really hard time staying engaged long term to finish this book because I would put it down and then not read it for a couple days because I forgot I was reading it. And the issue isn't that the book wasn't good. I think that it was well written. It was just not a story that necessarily appealed to me specifically. And as such, I might recommend it to others, but I probably would not read this book again myself. And with that, I'm going to jump into a quick wrap up. As my con might have indicated, I wasn't really sure where to put this book. And it's specifically because while I enjoyed it and there were really good things happening in the book, as soon as I put it down, it felt very forgettable. And so I ended up not really actually giving it a star rating because I felt like any star rating I would give it would be unnecessarily low because of my bias to how I felt overall. And you're like, oh, but that's the point of a review. But I really, really was not the intended audience for this. And because it's kind of more like a children's book, I don't feel comfortable necessarily giving it a rating because I was so outside the intended audience. And like I said, it wasn't even that it was bad. It was just, as soon as I put it down, the story became very forgettable. I likely will not read this book again. I may hold on to it with the intent of reading it to a child, but at the same time, I could easily donate this book and get it out of the library when I have a child who's of an appropriate age to read this with. Because I would consider this a good book for a kid because the pacing and progression were really consistent. The story was straightforward, easy to follow. The characters were easy to identify. They all had a unique voice and very specific goals, and then the overall goal was just very interesting. But again, overall, no rating for me on this. I won't pick it up again, most likely. And with that, I will just give you my standard warning. Although this front half has been relatively spoiler-free, the next section is my book club questions, so this will be a spoiler portion. So if you are not wanting to be spoiled, I would consider clicking off. All right. Welcome to the spoiler book club question section. I have my normal 6 questions that I'm going to go over briefly here. The first is, what is your initial reaction to the story? For me, it was both interest, but it was like tinged with a little bit of reluctance. Because within about 10 pages, I could tell I wasn't really the intended audience for this book. But having never actually read it, I was curious what like the original story was, so that's where the excitement and interest was from. Question 2, what is your favorite chapter or scene? For me personally, my favorite scene was when Jim is hiding behind these apple barrels and overhears the mutiny plan. I just thought it was really intriguing. It helps set some much more prominent boundaries for both the good and bad guys, and who fell where and who was in charge. It set a lot of things up that played out really nicely over the rest of the book. Question 3, how did the characters change throughout the story? I have to admit that the characters were pretty cut and dry. They largely didn't change. Given how Jim started and ended in the books, I'd say he probably is the only one who changed it all, and I think it was largely just general growth and maturity from the situation. Question 4, how did you like the ending? I was pretty satisfied with the ending. It was nice and tidy, but it also fit like the storytelling that was happening, and if it's the audience that I believe this is kind of intended to be geared towards, a younger audience, where this kind of happier ending with everything working out, I think would be really appealing. Question 5, would you read more by this author? I really, truly don't know. While I found the writing was good, it just wasn't engaging enough to keep my interest after putting the book down. So I would hesitate a little bit to pick something up unless I heard from somebody I trusted very strongly that the book was worth picking up. And then question 6, what other book or books does this book remind you of? And personally, I never really read a lot of books like this that had this specific storyline, so I don't really have a good recommendation here. I would actually say I have no recommendation here for this book because it is so different from what I read now, and I don't really have a memory of reading something similar when I was younger. And that's it. That's all. I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.